like the way I feel is that I had so few opportunities in my life to learn, to be exposed to things, whether it was by my family or just all together. And I just feel like I'm always grateful that anyone cares to listen to what I have to say. And I feel it's my responsibility, if I know something and I spent all this time fighting to gain knowledge and information, if I know it, then I just feel compelled to share it. And that gives me I get a lot of satisfaction from it. So
it's a philanthropy of sorts.
Yeah, I always say in the beginning, I was not for profit by default, not for lack of trying. But yeah, I just feel it's kind of a human connection, and it's a sense of like, I don't have a wide circle of friends I was just writing about. And all of everything that's important to me besides my kids, the only thing is art. And, without an audience, you're just screaming into a forest. And, like a painting needs a viewer, a critic and a teacher needs an audience. So even the best of artists, if the work is not seen, they're not communicating. And for me, this whole thing is about communication. So, for the most part, I do it for free, which I would do everything I do for free because I love it so much. And the rest, I always hope somehow will take care of itself.
Well, that's a good point about artists having to communicate, because I think there is a lot of discussion about, whether the artist can just sit and relax and do their work and then kind of subcontract the communication aspect. And you're talking a lot about communication.
Yeah, well, I think more than ever, as this world gets more diffusive and more the traditional relationships are going to be broken up, like just artist and dealer and gallerist, I think more than ever, it's important for people to take their fate into their own hands and come up with industrious ways of dealing. In any event, I just think that it's really important in more ways than one for artists not to be reliant on other people to get across what they're trying to convey. And so I just think that it's integral to the practice of any artist to be able to be responsible for conveying what they're doing to other people. And with social media today, in particular, it's the easiest it's ever been, because it used to be terribly difficult. There was no other way to talk to people with images other than through snail mail and these very archaic methods of communicating and transferring just visual images.
I'm an architect, but I have my art practice. And had it not been for the social media, I would have never had the confidence to carry on, actually.
And also, I've been writing for decades, but for the first 15 years of my writing, from the early 90s until, let's say, 2012 as a number, just to pull out of a hat. But before the advent of the smartphone in 2007 and Instagram in 2010, I was a late comer to the technology, although I began with Facebook in 2008 and did it incessantly until I quit it a few years ago. But anyway, until those formats, I didn't have an audience. I was nobody read what I was writing. I was writing for various small publications that were just locally disseminated magazines in New York and Soho in particular, and for some art magazines, a small assortment. And for ArtNet, when there were very few readers, because it just, you'd have to read it on a laptop and it just wasn't terribly well read. So my writing sort of mushroomed in around 2012, 2013, 14, 15 into something that it was never something I thought about or planned. I would never have even called myself a writer until the last 5-6 years, because no one read it. And again, it's like a contract that needs.
You're such an eloquent speaker.
It's funny because I was just writing now, I literally was catatonic. If you can imagine, my I mean, my mother passed away, was sick from when I was 12 and died when I was 13. I was overweight and I stuttered. I literally couldn't speak. I had a speech impediment until I was about 15 or 14. And I lived virtually like a solitary existence as a child, no friends, alone in my room, a very unsupportive father who was constantly abroad, traveling, not abroad, but traveling within the United States, and which for me was abroad at the time. And anyway, so like part of the reason that I'm so effervescent and ebullient and enthusiastic is really because I'm a late bloomer. And I just, for the first 15 years, I was barely alive. And it's no exaggeration. Like, I didn't even speak the way we're speaking now until I was like almost 15 years old, 14. I just didn't even have a conversation with another person. I just didn't. So in a way, I consider myself like basically 15 years younger than I am in years, because I was such a late bloomer. And so, so it's giving me a great deal of energy, which makes up for my lack of intelligence and enthusiasm for what I do, because I waited. And it's only in the last 10 years of my life that I've really, only in like the last few years of my life that I'm becoming basically comfortable enough in my skin to feel like truly actualized in a psychological sense of just discovering who I am and what my role is in my life, basically.
Was it hard work on a psychological level? Did you have to work on it? Or did it all unfold kind of, were you just quite lucky later on in life?
It's hard today, believe it or not. Like financially, I struggle all the time. I'm desperately trying to earn money all the time. And that's like the last aspect of my life that I've yet to resolve. I just can't make a steady income at what I do. It doesn't drive me crazy because I have enough, thank God, to, I've been collecting art for 30 years, and I probably all in all haven't done terribly well at it, but I have enough that for the last 2 Decembers, I've done these series of hoarder sales at Sotheby's. And although I've lost money both times, at least I have a way to just be able to, have money coming in on a quasi-yearly regular basis, enough that I could probably do it for the rest of my life and sustain myself and my family. So I'm still struggling. That's the last sort of...
Yeah, that's pressure in a way, yeah.
Nothing has come easy to me at all, ever. And I wouldn't want it. If it came easy to me, I would get bored and probably give it up and end up trying to learn math or science, which I still count on my fingers, and I have no proclivity for anything other than art. But I don't want I don't want things to come easy to me, because the struggle and the hustle, as much as it's frustrating and maddening, that's what I love about it. I don't want anything on a silver platter. I want to fight for it and create things from scratch. And that gives me the greatest degree of satisfaction in my life, is the fact that I never took an art class in my life, basically, until I was teaching one. So in that respect, I wouldn't have done anything differently if I did it again, other than, a few little things here and there, like more personal things like sobriety and stuff, which I haven't had a years of done drugs. But those were all just sort of covering up for my insecurities about, really finding out about who I was and how to go about resolving it.
There's one thing you mentioned at the very start, and that is that you don't have a kind of big circle of friends. Didn't realize how good friends you were with Zaha Hadid. And I just kind of wanted to ask you about that friendship, because you always you mention it, but you don't really talk about it.
Well, it's kind of, I can go on and on for hours. They're actually making a film about her that was initiated by her foundation. And literally just a few days ago, I had an hour-long discussion about her. But it was a very incongruous friendship. And it grew to be basically one of the closest 1 or 2 friends I had. And in the beginning, I've always had this very holistic, organic approach to art. So for me, anything done creatively and with passion is art. And I was never like, I'm not a great fan of architecture per se, but I mean, if you're gonna have a chair, if you're gonna have a building, if you're gonna have a car or a painting or anything, why not have one that's artful, creative, and great, and passionate. So anyway, like in the beginning, I've always had these kind of far-fetched kind of ideas about how to make a living, and none of them ever work out, including my idea about real estate. So when I first picked up and moved to London in 2004, I just simply noticed, I mean, because I'm aware, and Zaha, before she even won the Pritzker Prize, she was well known within architecture circles and design, and her work had come to my attention. And I always, like I say, I'm always interested in this kind of like a contrary. I never want to do something that's obvious or well trodden, whether it's any part of my life, professionally or personally. So anyway, I came across this person, Zaha, through my readings, and I was aware that she was, although she was quite kind of well known within her sphere and beyond even at that point, although she wasn't world famous, it came to my attention that she had never built a building in the United Kingdom where she had lived for 30 years at that point or more. And she had famously won this competition in Cardiff to design an opera house, and it was just unceremoniously pulled out from under her because she was outspoken, a female, an Arab female, who freely expressed herself in no uncertain terms. And like with a lot of artists that I really care about, although things have markedly changed over the last 5 to 10 years, being a woman and being an Arab or being a person of color or different sexual proclivities, the art world is one of the most racist industries in the world. And only in the last couple of years has the floodgates opened for Black artists and female artists. But they're still far from anything resembling parity in terms of what they get paid or what their art fetches. So anyway, I just noticed that I had a house that I had lived in New York City, and I bought a space in the East End of London, and I came across this architect, and I loved the fact that yet she had quite a great reputation in architectural circles. She had never built anything. So the idea was simply to like develop a building with an architect that had never built before, because she was sort of uncharted territory in that respect. She'd only built this firehouse, which was never really used as a firehouse for Vitra.
I mean, she was a paper architect.
Yeah, because her work, because she was so inspired and driven by like Russian constructivism and art, she would try to convey her pitch for a building by showing like a deconstructed geometric abstraction, and people can hardly, unless they're visionary like she was, it's hard to like appreciate or understand how a building, a painting of an exploded shapes could somehow constitute the basis for a building in bricks and mortar. But anyway, so I initially contacted the firm and maybe had a brief telephone conversation with her. I literally just cold called her on my way to the airport like one morning and looked up the number and left a message on the machine of the practice, and ended up in a discussion with her and Patrick Schumacher, which we won't get into right now in this context, but that's a whole other can of worms. But anyway, and I forged a relationship with Patrick, and Zaha made some renderings for a building in New York that I never built. And then over the course of years, I was trying to do a building in London, but I just never had the courage to do it or the resources. And really, I mean, I'm barely good at art, which is my profession. So I was never going to make the leap of faith to try to build a building, which Zaha relentlessly antagonized me about over the years of our relationship. But in the beginning, like many people, I was fearful of her, like reputation and persona that went before her. And I forged this early relationship with the closest thing out of her practice, which grew to be more than 400 people, the closest she ever had to a partner, though he was not a stakeholder at all in the business until after she died, was Patrick. And because I had this interest, I basically, before I knew art existed, as an alienated kids in the suburbs, I came across like industrial design expressed through cars. And I was never into sports, and I was never into cars other than the way they looked. For me, that was like the gateway drug into art and design, were these cars, and they just appealed to me in a very kind of subconscious, basic way in terms of the forms that they were designed. And at the time, more so than now, although you still find it, cars were handmade and there was an extraordinary amount of detail in the 70s when I was a kid. And that's when I first sort of forged relationships with the design of these vehicles. And then through Patrick, I said I wanted to commission the firm to design a car for me, which was basically just a whim. And more than architecture, now I'm teaching a class beginning next Thursday at New York University on design. And I'm petrified because it's still like, I mean, if it was an art class, I would throw myself into it and I would voraciously suck up as much information as I could. And I would be an expert in a matter of days because it just comes so naturally to me through hard work. But I never was as crazy about architecture or design, which I grew to also have a profession in. But even to this day, it's like, it's not my natural inclination is more to the aesthetics of fine art than it was to design. And anyway, like when I moved to the UK in 2004, I basically, to backtrack a little, like I was always casting around for something to do that was creative, but also a way to make a living. And I never knew that art was bought or sold well into my 20s. I didn't know art galleries existed until I was nearly 27, and I had never stepped into one until that period. So, and then I studied law, I studied philosophy. I went into 100 different businesses, from the stock exchange to fashion. And then I stumbled into art after Andy Warhol's estate sale at Sotheby's in 1988. But I ran away from business. I went into art during a deep, deep recession, which lasted from like 1990, 91, the fall of 1990. It lasted for 5 or 6 years, way worse than the 2008 recession. And I would say like almost as bad as this COVID tragedy, which has decimated the economies worldwide. But anyway, art became bigger. In around 2004, I got bored in New York. I moved with my family to the United Kingdom. And then art became bigger than the business I was running away from. And it turned into everything I was like, that turned me off about ever working in the field of business. Art became less and less about the pure kind of kernels of creativity. And it turned into just the monetization of creative expression. And I got really bored. Not that I ever made a lot of money at it. I never did until a certain stage later on, but that's yet again another story. Anyway, and then when I got Zaha's firm to design a car for me, and then I literally just like blagged my way into getting a stand in a really giant car show in London called at Excel. And I never told Zaha. I just worked with Patrick. He put me in touch with the project architect. We designed a car, and I literally got the firm, because I never do things normally. I never do things easily. And most things I do make 0 sense practically. So I got the firm to design this booth for me, and they designed this like free-flowing organic island on the floor, which this 1-to-1 scale model of a car sat on. And then I was like in this commercial car fair exhibiting a car, which was nothing more than just like an idea that I had. And
it's a bit of an art project.
Less than an art project. And it was like most things I do in life are absurd and like foolish and almost bordering on ridiculous. It is ridiculous. So there I was in this commercial car fair with a booth that looked better than any booth in the entire fair, better than General Motors, better than Ferrari and Aston Martin. And I had this car, which was nothing more than a ridiculous, like an act of futility. And then it was picked up by car magazines. And then I was like, back and forth at the firm trying to get planning permission for this building I never built. And then I bumped into Zaha in the parking lot, and she cornered me and started screaming at me, as she was wont to do to many people. And she's like, what are you doing these projects without even speaking to me? Who do you think you are? And then I was like, I was flustered. And I said, I don't even know how to get in touch with you. I don't even have your phone number or your email. And then she gave me her email. And then from then on in, she became like my closest friend. And we had lunch every Sunday for years. Patrick got married ultimately. And then he had been really, really personally close to Zaha. For the first time in their relationship, he began turning off his phone on the weekends, and it would drive her to distraction. And because she never had a partner personally in her life, I literally traveled all over the world with her, to Azerbaijan, to Spain, to New York, to
she must have been incredible company.
It was like, I'm getting chills just thinking about it, and I don't want to start getting upset about it, but it was just the craziest thing. I never shut up about myself. I'm an egomaniac, megalomaniac, like most people that are artists and in the art world and writers, etc. But when it came to my time with Zaha, I rarely, if ever, mentioned a single thing that I did professionally. And at that point, like at first I was doing design fairs, so I curated 7 worldwide exhibitions for Zaha. Because I became so friendly with her, it quickly spread throughout literally the world. I would get phone calls from Australia, from New York, from all over the world, of people that wanted to get in touch with Zaha but couldn't. And I was this weird conduit, because she called me every day and drove me crazy. And like she was keeping an eye on me and gossiping with me, and we just became really, really close. And I wrote about her, I curated shows for her at Sonnabend, one of the greatest galleries in New York. Even Norman Foster's wife, Elena, contacted me to do a show with Zaha, and I ended up doing a show with Zaha at Norman and Elena Foster's space in Madrid. And Elena has a great publishing company called Ivory Press, and she's done books and projects with artists. And I curated this show, sort of curated, but I facilitated this giant show for Zaha in Madrid. And then there I was sitting on a panel sandwiched between Norman Foster and Zaha Hadid. And Norman was drawing all the time. And then like during this panel, he spoke, then Zaha spoke, and then it was my turn to speak. And Zaha grabbed the mic and said, like, what are you even doing here? Like, and I said, Zaha, you had your turn to speak, and now it's mine. And that was the nature of like the closeness of our relationship. And then I spoke, and it was just this crazy, like accidental situation, like in the, what's his name? In the film where where he became, where he went from being a gardener to being the president. What's his name? The famous comedian, Peter Sellers.
Okay.
Anyway, so like, and I was curating these worldwide exhibitions for Zaha. And then like the recession happened in 2008. And I basically was doing these, I'll never forget, I was led into Basel Art Fair in this section where you were given literally a shipping container to present some works on the beach. So you weren't in the hierarchy of art fairs, which are ridiculously political. I wasn't allowed in the fair, but I was given this stupid shipping container. But I would never like accept such a mediocre structural context. So I literally commissioned Zaha to make our own shipping container, which was built in Austria and shipped in 12. Literally, they built this structure and then sawed it into 12 parts and cost me hundreds and hundreds of thousands of euros. I lost every cent. And it was never finished at the opening. There were 50,000 LED lights in it. And then in the beginning, she's like, she wouldn't even acknowledge it as her project. Because in the beginning of when, I don't know, it's a long story, but anyway,
She wasn't happy. She wasn't happy about it.
She wasn't happy until I threw the fucking thing away because I couldn't afford to store it anymore. And then and then she's like, where is it? And I'm like, now you're asking me where it is. You like it? When I built it, you hated it, and now you want it, and it doesn't exist anymore because I couldn't afford to keep it anymore. It was one of my worst commercial experiences, but I love stuff like that. I'm a very kind of, yeah, whatever. Anyway,
that gives us, I think that gives us a good sense of that relationship. Because I think I kind of feel satisfied now because I feel like I know more of it. Definitely.
A quick thing, because she was Muslim, Arab, and I'm a Jew from Long Island, but religion doesn't exist for me. And Zaha's only religion was architecture and design. And I brought her into this gray area that didn't really exist, which was some hybrid of art, design, and architecture. Sometimes she embraced it and sometimes she cursed me for it because we got a bad review in the New York Times and the writer was such an asshole and so myopic about it, about his view was so stupid. But she created this extraordinary installation and then she looked at me and said, thanks a lot for this negative review but anyway, we did these things. And anyway, it was always about the projects and always about this great kind of, not compromise, but this, collaboration between us, where I pushed her and she pushed me just to be around such brilliance.
Exposure, yeah.
Just exposure to Zaha Hadid's mind, so intimately and so regularly. And I love to just absorb her greatness. So as a result, like I said, I would never mention anything of what I do. And at one point before she died, I had a phone call from her congratulating me. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I had won this obscure writing prize as Art Writer of the Year in 2016, whenever it was, just before she passed away. And I never even told her that I wrote about art. But she tried to get me to run her studio for 10 years. And I always thought, as much as I love her to death, I would never, that's a job that wasn't particular. I mean, she used to look at me and say, you're not serious. You just what do you do all day? Watch television. But she knew, in the back of her mind, she knew exactly what I did. And she was wildly supportive. And anyway, that was it. And I just remember at one point I was saying before about, I would argue with her about religion and Israeli politics. And I'm no Zionist and I hate religion. For me, it's art. For her, it's architecture. But I just remember, my wife would say to me, why even go there with her? But we were so, she would say, oh, some of my best friends are Jewish. And I'm like, Zaha, that's what we say in America. If you subtly are racist against, African Americans, you say, oh, some of my best friends are Black and whatever. This is a flippant conversation about some very important issues. But I love Zaha more than anything. And she enriched my life in the most basic ways of just telling me what the possibilities are, even though she came from, I interviewed her for Pinup Magazine years and years ago. And one of my questions were, have you always been so self-confident? And she just snapped at me, yes, with one word. And she came from a society that was wildly embracing of all of the arts in Iraq in the 50s. And her family was incredibly supportive of her. So I just love to absorb the kind of, even though she never was financially destitute when she was growing up, she still created a career in the face of great obstacles. And as a result, what I loved about her most was not just the architecture, which didn't break the glass ceiling, but exploded it, but it was just the pure kind of ambition and tenacity of pursuing a career in front of countless obstacles and adversity. And that kind of inclination is what really inspired me and does so every day of my life, really.
There is something, I worked as an architect for about 5 years after I graduated from the AA. And one of the reasons why I sort of quit my job and started to kind of work on my arts and do other things was because I felt architecture being quite oppressive. And I think there is a lesson in Zaha and her approach. You know, I felt that kind of going into art is kind of an escape into something far freer. You know, I always felt architecture was oppressive because it never showcases the kind of identity of an architect the way art does. And, you know, as an architect, in the work of Zaha, you don't see that she's, you know, an Arab woman. You just see a work that is kind of transcending boundaries, right? But then that was a kind of also a lesson in the other direction. As I kind of started to approach art and learn about the art world, I realized there is something good in the kind of approach that the architectural field has of not kind of being a kind of identity obsessed.
Well, I mean, to start from the beginning of your notion, art and architecture are among the two most conservative industries in the world, which is kind of antithetical to the thought of most people. I mean, to this day, the art world, I find, I've been in fashion, finance, a lawyer, stock market, writer for law firms and various other professions, and art remains among the most conservative industries I've ever experienced, and architecture the same. And part of it is, like architecture, it's a zero-sum game, meaning in economic theory that one person's opportunity is at the direct expense of someone else. So in a way, there's only so many buildings that get built in a city or in the world, and therefore it's ridiculously hyper inordinately competitive. And same with art, there's only so many galleries, so many museums, so there's only so few opportunities to exhibit, and the level of competition is nuts. And another thing is that in terms, I also remember asking Zaha, do you ever have a sense of humor in your work? Which she just like blasted me for even asking, and answered no. But I mean, the worst thing you can say to Zaha was, you're the greatest Arab female architect in the world. Those are two characterizations that were anathema to her, that she would just recoil at. She wanted to be a great architect, period. And in a way, I mean, you don't want to see a girl building or a boy building, although most buildings, like let's say Norman Foster's Pickle building in East London, looks like a giant penis or something. So I guess there are organic forms that she single-handedly introduced into the practice of architecture. But I just think mainly these are terribly conservative industries because opportunity, I mean, when you think about the overall scope of the architecture business, Norman Foster is probably one of the few architects in the world that became rich from it. And at one point he sold his practice to a private equity company. In the end, it proved to be a disastrous investment and he bought it back. And Zaha's probably potentially the most lucrative, prosperous architecture firm, surely the only one that has survived to the extent that it's flourishing after her demise. I can't think that it's ever happened to that extent, where not only have they not had to lay off a single architect after she died, but it's growing in spite of Patrick's haphazard, crazy mentality in terms of the life.
And suddenly I'm faced with a set of rules, you know, you kind of have to be self-referential. Your work has to do that. So you have to have so many exhibitions. You have to have exhibited here, here, and there.
I mean, it's stifling, and it's 100% true. And my whole life is commenting upon and analyzing art, the dissemination of art in the stream of commerce that has evolved around it, and the machinations of the art world and art market. But the fact is, it's a very, I mean, I made 2 art pieces about it when I first switched into the art world in the 90s. And they deal exactly with this issue, and you can find them both on YouTube. One of them was in Japan, they're such a pent up, retentive society that literally business people can go to a company after work and pay money to go into a room and break everything just to act out and to get the frustrations out of day-to-day tedious life in corporate Japan. And everything is like, you're not allowed, I mean, there's a culture of not the opposite of self-expression, where you're meant to really exist within a tightly knit community and toe the line. And I had this false notion before I entered the art world, which was that it was a bunch of people getting drunk on absinthe, hanging from the chandelier and having wild orgies with each other. And I'll never forget, like in the early 90s, when I deep dived into the profession, curating exhibitions of my peers and myself, that not only are there a lot of rules in the art world, but they're all unwritten and unspoken. I remember, like, I would curate shows and I would put my own, okay, rule number one, everything I've done is wrong in my life. Everything in my relationships, professionally, personally, is just one giant misstep. But like, so I would curate shows because it was the only way I was going to get my works, because I was making art immediately. Like, I always say, I'm not an idiot savant, I'm an idiot savant, because I was always, I mean, I made up for my lack of intelligence through hard work and tenacity. But like, the first rule I would break was I wanted to get my art seen and I wanted to get involved, but who would ever hire someone that never took an art class in their entire life and only began teaching art history so I could learn art history? So I curated, I just had this do-it-yourself mentality. Before the word pop-up existed, we used to call them hit-and-run shows. So I would just trade stuff that I had accumulated because I became a lawyer somehow, had a little bit of money. I would collect a bit of art, and then I would trade it to landlords to curate shows. I would put my art in my own shows, which was like rule number one broken. Number two, I would stay open Sundays and Mondays. Why would galleries across the world be closed on Sunday, which is the day that everyone is free to go see them? Why? Because they're really only interested in the people that will buy art from the galleries. They're not, I mean, I understand they're trying to make a living. They're not for profits. But still, you would think an artist needs to get their work seen by as many people as possible. And why wouldn't galleries want to facilitate that? Because you could easily try to sell art on Sunday. And anyway, so the art world is like the mafia and the code of silence. And it's all about, anyway, so I made one piece where I took all my wedding gifts, created like a fake living room in a corner of my house, and then proceeded to smash everything in the room to act out in a way that the art world, which I thought would be conducive towards behaving as such, but it was the opposite. And the other one was like, I mean, again, like you associate creative industries like music and writing and theater and all of the creative pursuits in life. You seem to think they all share these characteristics of being freewheeling and liberal and open-minded, but they're not. And the art world in particular is worse than Wall Street. I mean, in terms of this mentality that you're talking about. So I did another piece where, again, when I made these videos, it wasn't about me at all. It was always filmed from behind. You would never see my face. It was just about this kind of expression or the lack of it, how it's not condoned in the art world to be free in the most basic sense. So I did another one where I was dressed like a rock and roll singer. And then I just proceeded to scream at the top of my lungs for like 5 minutes. And it was videoed by a guy called John Kelsey, who is part of an art collective called Rena Spalding, who has a gallery as well. And it was edited by Jonathan Horowitz, who's a great video art maker and just artist, I should say. Anyway, and it was just like a music video without music. And it was just me screaming. And I was acting out the way a musician, it's permissible to act out in such a way. But in the art world, when you act out in a way that you would think is inherent to the industry, you're cast aside and you're considered to be a pariah because you don't do things the way that they are supposed to be done. So all galleries look the same and have the sterile clinical architectural and surrounding the white cube. And galleries are only open from 10 to 6 from Tuesday to Saturday. And there are certain behaviors that are condoned. And if you dare go astride or afield from what is accepted, then you're cast aside. So only now, where again, through the kind of facilitation of this kind of almost anarchistic mentality through social media, has the hierarchies begin to be chipped away and opened up, in the sense that you could be living anywhere in the world and still access the market. You could, I remember well-known contemporary artists writing me a letter when I started to get some critical response to my curatorial practice. And he said, help me, how can I get a foothold into the art world? And I just wrote back 3 words for move to New York, which I wasn't intending to be an asshole, because I was just helping him in the only way that you could facilitate a career, which was to be in proximity to where the art world was, which was.
What would you say today? What would be the 4 words now, if you were to receive the same letter?
Post it.
Oh, that's good.
Do it yourself. Don't be reliant on any structures, or don't abide by any strictures. Just do it, like a stupid kind of Nike commercial. But more than that, doing it is not enough, actually, I should say. You have to express it, and Instagram, for lack of any alternative as we speak, surely it will be replaced in due course. But for the time being, Instagram is a gift. And I love the fact that any art platform, including the one I write for, ArtNet, Art News, Artsy, they all suck. They're all ineffective in every which way, other than, ArtNet is good to research auction results and to write articles and have it seen. But equally, there's a million different websites that feature art writing and art making. Just get the word out there by any means necessary. Unfortunately, due to this tragic economic and health crisis that we're in the middle of, there are more empty storefronts than ever in my life I can remember. Take over a storefront, do a show, post it online, band together with a group of people to expand your audience, and then do it, post it, and don't be shy about reaching out to people through direct message in a way that I've gotten in touch with everyone, and people get in touch with me 50 times a day from all walks of life, young people, old people, rich people, poor people. Don't underestimate it, and I hate dealers or people in the art world that dismiss social media as like, you can't make any sweeping generalizations about a tool that is by far the most effective means that I've ever seen to communicate and to create accessibility and break down hierarchies. That's a revolution.
So really doesn't matter where you are in the world.
Even with the lack of travel, because of course the world is opened up through art fairs and various events and exhibitions. Prior to COVID, there was more globalism in the best sense of the word than ever before. But now that things are veritably shut down, I seem to be the only idiot who's still traveling all the time. But now you can travel through the computer. And of course, in no sense of the term can the internet ever be a substitution for looking at art, but it certainly is by far the most effective way to reach out to the widest possible audience.
So when you moved to London in what, 2000 and something?
2004 to 2019.
But your show, I Hate New York, was in 2000?
That was in 2000, where I nearly got stabbed to death and thrown down the stairs and robbed at knife point. I quickly changed my mind and began.
Is that when you decided to move to London?
No, that's why I decided to go back to London again for the rest of my life. And when I came back to New York after that exhibition in 2000, I spent 3 months in London. I kissed the tarmac like the Pope. I was so grateful to be home, because believe it or not, New York is by far a much safer place than London is today in terms of petty and violent street crime. Everyone in my family has been mugged. My house has been broken into. Anyway, I moved back because I just got complacent and bored in New York with the wild commercialization of art. And when I started curating in the year like 1990, there were literally, during the recession, there were no galleries that would entertain exhibiting the work of unsolicited submissions. And I was one of the 2 or 3 only people in New York that would do so, because I was doing these freewheeling group shows. And then by the time I left New York, there were literally 500 galleries showing the work of emerging artists. And I became superfluous in effect. And I just got bored with the fact that I had no role. In the beginning, I had a great role, not great, but I had a role in creating a platform for a multitude of emerging artists to showcase their work and use as a stepping stone artists that had never showed their work before, literally, like Cecily Brown and Wade Guyton and Rachel Harrison, who had a retro at the Whitney, and countless artists, some well-known, many not well-known still, but they had a place to show their work in my kind of sloppy group shows that I curated for 15 years in New York. And then it became unnecessary in a sense, because there were hundreds of galleries that were fulfilling the same role, but more professionally than I ever did or could.
So when you look around the world today, is there any place that you think, oh, that's quite exciting as a kind of geographical location where things are happening?
I mean, I'm not interested in geography, I'm interested in art. So in the same way I wasn't interested in Zaha as a female architect, I was interested in Zaha as a super gifted, hardworking genius who for some reason was denied opportunities that others in her field were enjoyed. And in the same sense, I just look for art that strikes me. And I think it's more important to dissolve these barriers of entry and geographical divides. I mean, if there was more of a mentality like that, the world would be a much safer and better place. And it's a travesty the way it seems to go forward. You have to go 6 steps backwards. And in America, like, to have a president so divisive and racist and narrow-minded is shocking at this stage of society, that we can have someone so blind and ignorant and dumb. It's shocking, but nevertheless, you know, there's no straight line of trajectory of history. It just doesn't exist. Things happen in zigzags. And so for me, I just think the only geography I'm interested in is like the accessibility of the internet and how I'm able to traverse time zones and countries just to see whatever pops up if you look hard enough. So even on Instagram, you can't just sit there passively. You have to dig and dive and look and look and look. But the more you look, the more you look, the more you, like there was Christopher Wool piece, the harder you look, the harder you look. And it's true. I mean, the reason I write is to learn. And because if I'm writing about an art fair, it's a hell of a lot different than just going to spectate at an art fair, because I have to convey things in a cohesive fashion, or in my case, a quasi-cohesive fashion. So if I'm like going to an auction or going to an art fair, if I have to teach it in a class or write it in an article, it makes me pay attention in a much more focused fashion. And in the same way, yeah, that's it. You just have to pay more attention.
You are very critical, obviously, and sarcastic about the art world. Presumably, at some point, you were really excited about it. You thought this is incredible, and then you realized it's not that great. There are things about it that are not great. And so why did you then kind of carry on going deeper and deeper into it?
Well, first of all, it's like you don't choose art so much as art chooses you. So I believe, I mean, I created my life and my profession, literally. I mean, the way I do what I do is unique, for better or worse. But so in a sense, I just found something that I had a natural inclination for aesthetics maybe, but I had to develop it and learn it. So I think like, I'm very much of the mind that you're fully formed at 5 years old as a person. Mm-hmm. So that's why for me, I get along better with children and animals than I do with adults, because I have respect for the viewpoints and reactions of children as much as I do, if not more so, for the average person professionally involved in the art world. But I never turned sour on art. I was sour about it from the first day I ever entered a gallery and was looked up and down and pigeonholed and judged and etc. So I think because I came from outside the professional structures and strictures of art, that has informed everything I've ever done in the art world. So because, I mean, I consider myself today, as I'm sitting here after 30 plus years in the art world, I'm an insider, obviously, but I'm an outsider forever. So I'm very much an outside insider. And I'll always have this kind of contrarian maverick approach to everything I do because I was never steeped in what you can't do. So from the first day I entered the gallery, I was shocked and I was taken aback and I was awed and I was appalled by this mentality. So having been in fashion, like everyone could buy a dress, no matter how bad your taste is or how awful you look in it, or a suit. And at the same time, the art world is the only place where they make all of these characterizations about you the minute you walk in the door. And like they decide whether or not you're worthy of owning this piece of art. So because you would never know that I was interested in fashion because I dress in rags and quasi, not to be dismissive or flippant, but like a quasi homeless person, because I wear the same thing every day. I eat the same thing.
Kenny, is that a statement? Is that a statement, or is it?
I would be disingenuous.
Comfort.
I dress for comfort. I mean, I think I have style, if you want to know the truth about it. And like Zaha would always make fun of me because even before the Adidas, I was wearing jeans every day, and they were a little bit.
So when did you start wearing Adidas then?
I wore them in the 90s, but never to the extent where I literally have not worn another pair of pants for like 5 years. So even when I was wearing a sport jacket and like with Zaha, I wouldn't show up for lunch like I do now, although I was close, but there would always be a t-shirt strategically sticking out on the right side or like a shirt tail hanging out on the left side. And she would look at me with scorn and just say, like, she knew full well that was a conscious determination about how I presented myself. So in a way, it's like I want to say, like, I'm dressing to go to this restaurant to fit with this society, but in a way I'm doing it in a little, it's rebellious, but it's not like, now it's more tragic than anything else, the way I am. But like, I remember sitting next to Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, at a breakfast, and he was going to speak, and like, 10 minutes before he got on stage to speak, and I was literally, I was contiguous to him on the table next to him, and he tousled his hair for like a good 10 minutes, and then he ruffled his shirts until they were just askew. So everything.
So you do have something in common.
Well, I think he's fucking hilarious, and he has an extraordinary sense of humor. So like people, I hate politics and religion co-equally, and I think neither of them does anyone ever good. I mean, politicians are generally not clever enough to be entrepreneurs and not talented enough to be entertainers. And I can't remember in my entire life a politician that did something good that I would want to emulate in my life. So anyway, the Adidas is really, in a way, like I have like a collection of 40 pairs of vintage Adidas, but for the first 3 or 4 years where I only wore them. So I bought them in the 90s, put them aside, but always would wear them on the weekends, and then like, after, I don't know, then it just came to the point where, but they're all
gaining in value.
In value, no.
Yeah.
And all the old, I mean, no.
You can sell them. Anyway, you can sell them as Sotheby's.
Well, I've just spoken to Adidas about potentially designing my own little line of them. And at Sotheby's, I actually asked them if I could put in a few of my pairs as a lot in the sale, which they just ignored completely. But when I have quarter 3 next December, I'm going to, no matter what they say. And also, like, I have a friend of my kids who's a fashion designer, and because I only wear long sleeve t-shirts that are big, that I could drape them over my bad physique, and now I couldn't even fit into the jeans I used to wear, so now it can be defined as strictly for comfort. But now I basically help design like a group of shirts that incorporate either like weird cars that I've owned. One is like text from a Christopher Wool painting, "You Make Me." Another one says "Art Critic." And so now I'm basically getting more involved in defining the way that I look. What I'm most interested in is finding underappreciated artists in which there's no consensus of. For instance, I found an artist on Instagram that I've never stopped proselytizing about, whose name is Eva Berison. And I can't remember, who stumbled upon who first. Neither of us can, but we found each other. And since then, I have posted her works incessantly and promoted them in whatever way I can. And now there are 3 galleries across Europe she's showing at, and a few major galleries that are interested in her work. And to be able to, in a way, besides being a writer, teacher, and maker of art, a really important thing to me is to be a facilitator. And I love being in this position of being able to assist artists gain an audience for what they're doing. So I'm not like pretentious or presumptuous enough to think that I have an audience that I've developed through my writing, and I'm able to refocus that or to utilize that audience largely through Instagram and my writing for ArtNet and various other publications, and through my teaching, to bring other talented people's work to light, which gives me an immense degree of satisfaction, to the extent that even today, I went to a studio visit yesterday and saw the work of an artist who, I get sent art, like literally every week I get 2 or 3 pieces of art just sent to me by people. And sometimes I forge relationships with them and other times I don't. But I went to an artist studio who I met because she just sent me a drawing like a year ago. And then we maintained a small relationship through DM, and I came to really understand and appreciate her art. I went to the studio yesterday and I woke up this morning wanting to help her. And I made 2 phone calls and got her an audience with, Johann Koenig Gallery in Berlin and another gallery in London, Simon Lee. And the fact that I can get them to countenance or to take heed of what I've suggested, like literally instantaneously, it just brought such a degree of satisfaction to me in such a meaningful way, because like, who am I? I'm nobody who started with nothing, and I'm able to like reach these people that have been involved in art their whole lives. So it just means a great deal to me, the fact that I can impact on as much my own life and the lives of my kids as the lives of other people whose work that I have a relationship to.
Is that a commentary on what art institutions should be doing?
Well, I just think people shouldn't take the easy road and the safe road. And I know it's a stupid thing to say, because museums are broke and they're selling off their collections, largely because we're in one of the most unprecedented biological viruses or tragedies that certainly hasn't been experienced in 100 years since the last major pandemic. So we're in an unprecedented, tragic economic situation, social and biological, which is just absolutely killing people, literally and figuratively. And there are more unemployed, starving people in the United States than way beyond the Great Depression, making the kind of massive recession in 2008 look like a joke. So anyway, it's like, you can't say that galleries and museums should be more open-minded about what they're exhibiting, because now is not, I tell artists when they get in touch with me today, how do I get a start? How can I have my work seen? I tell them, don't go to any galleries right now. It's not the right time, because galleries are trying to survive in the same way that museums, it's a disgrace how quickly museums are selling off their collection to help pay the bills. It should never happen, and it should only be a means of last resort. And I guess in certain respects, that's what we're experiencing right now. But yeah.
But Kenny, as a consequence of COVID-19, I personally have a feeling that museums will be just showing ever more Andy Warhol exhibitions, ever more Picasso exhibitions.
True.
Is there
100% true? And for the first time, I can't argue with that fact because it's a matter of survival right now. So the blockbuster exhibition, which I think is just a weak form of entertainment, basically the art world always feeds on success. So the reason that an artist like Damien Hirst makes 2,000 spot paintings, you can't, it's society at large that acts as an enabler. And like the license to print money isn't just the makings of the artist, it's because all the idiots that collect it want the same thing that their friends have, and success affirms success. And that's the nature of the society we live in, you know, and as a result, if museums have to keep their doors open, they need money, they need an audience. And in most jurisdictions, museums are still closed completely under lockdown. Thankfully, in New York and in the United States, we're not under. I mean, Los Angeles is, but New York isn't. So I went to galleries and studios yesterday after I got my 20th COVID test, because I just came back from the UK. But there are no museums or galleries open in London, which is just a travesty, besides all the deaths, obviously. So I think that for the next 3 to 5 years, museums and galleries are going to have their hands tied and be handicapped in their programming, because they're only going to be able to show what's safe. And it's like that even in the best of times, unfortunately, but now it's just a matter of survival. So it's not something that I could level a criticism for, because there's just no option at this point.
And so your message is basically that the artist completely has to self-represent in a way, that not rely on museum or gallery or anything, on any structure that exists.
Right. I think artists need to be flexible and sell their work cheaply. And I mean, I get sometimes questions like, how do I control who buys my work, and how do, you know, because there's this whole flipping, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still like thousands of artists, like, because the art world has grown more in the past 25 years than the previous 250 years, there's still more than probably, well, I don't know what the number is, maybe it's into the hundreds or low thousands of artists that their work is still flippable, meaning that speculators could buy art primarily in the primary market at one price, and immediately they can resell it at a higher price on the secondary market. So these opportunities still exist, they're just fewer than ever before in the recent past, where the market has grown so exponentially. So there are still instances, anyway, whenever like an emerging artist will ask me, how do I like control who's buying my work? I say to them, I would sell my work to any crackhead in the street that wanted to buy it.
To anyone.
To anyone. I mean, I'm in no position to pick and choose who buys my work. I understand if you're Cecily Brown and if your work sells for $500,000 at Paula Cooper and the following day it's worth 1.2 million on the secondary market, you have the luxury of, and it's your obligation to try to place your work with someone who at least likes it, for Christ's sakes. And a lot of these idiots that are making a living in the art world today don't even know what art has no meaning to them other than a tool to make money. So, I mean, I asked this one speculator, which I call them, like, what does art even mean to you? And he couldn't even come up with an answer before he threatened to sue ArtNet and get me suspended over the summer for writing about him. And Sotheby's gave me some information that, though was probably factually inherently correct, wasn't completely 100% true. But I mean, art has no meaning to these people. It's like a widget, and a widget is like a fungible, you know, analogy for a commercial thing that could be bought and sold in the marketplace, used in like law school or business school lessons, for example, as a generic, you know, object to be bought and sold in the marketplace. And I think, like I just said to one of these idiots, like, what is art? Tell me what art means to you in the most basic, fundamental level. And like during the quarantine, I have to say there's a lot of good, and there's been a complete reawakening once you get past the death toll and the sickness, I mean, I spent 3 months in my house in New York looking at my art collection every day and studying to teach a Zoom class at School of Visual Arts, which shockingly was the first studio. I mean, I took a drawing class in law school and a sculpture class in law school. First, the only art history classes I've ever taken were the ones I taught. And I've been teaching art and economics at the University of Zurich for 10 years. And I've been lecturing largely about things we're talking about, just the practicalities, the pragmatics of having a life in the art world, which art school never prepares you for. But then I gave a lecture at School of Visual Arts when I first moved to New York. My kid was graduating fine art, and I knew the director of the graduate school, David Ross, and I just said, can I teach? And
yeah,
he said,
that was a great lecture.
Oh, thank you so much. So you can watch that lecture on YouTube. And I said, please let me lecture. And I love to share and help, don't get me wrong, but I teach to learn first and foremost. And I taught the class just because I was teaching throughout my life in London, and I was moving to New York, and I hadn't taught in New York in 15 years, where I taught at the New School, where I was hired on probation for my first ever class, because I never had any classes in art, but I had a Juris Doctor degree in law. And then the dean hired me on probation for 6 lectures, and then he left the school. So I was on the books as an adjunct teacher, and I went on to lecture at Yale, Columbia, RISD, all over the world, all from just caring about learning and teaching. And anyway, I gave a lecture in New York at School of Visual Arts, and then I just said at the dinner afterward, please, can I teach? And I thought I'd be teaching the same crap that I always teach, which is this bullshit of what we're talking about. And then I went to sign up then I got the class, and I was told to go into the human resources department to sign the forms. And the woman said to me, do you want to know what your class is? And I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? This is as good as time as any. I thought it was just going to be, I thought it was going to be more of the same. And she said, you're teaching a senior studio class, and your lecture will be 6 hours from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Tuesday. And besides the shock of the hours, like having to be cognizant at 9 o'clock in the morning, that was the first studio class that I've ever been in, besides the drawing class I took, where we were like drawing nudes, which I could barely draw a stick figure to this day. And anyway, like that was the first studio class I've ever been in. So what was the question again? I lost my train.
I don't know what the question was. I think that it's. I think education is a whole other very interesting topic, and the art education. And one thing that you often say that that completely resonates with me is this notion of unlearning. I had a friend who was deaf, who studied at the AA with me, and he was always getting this transcript. This person was sitting next to him, always transcribing what was said, and
Yeah.
it was quite a bad transcription. And then a few years later, he realized he found some much better transcription service, and he realized how shit this transcription that he was gaining his education through was. And he was really, for a couple of days, he was shaken. He couldn't communicate with the world, having realized that his education was basically one big black hole. At which point I looked at him and I said, "You're so lucky. You're so lucky. I mean, of course you're not lucky because you're deaf, but at the same time, it's a filter to the world that just throws so much rubbish at you." And I think that's what your notion of unlearning kind of reminds me of.
Well, that's a great point. And that's, a really good point, because that defines my entire life. And because I was never aware, I wasn't aware of the commercial structure of art. I just published a little interview on Instagram yesterday for some online news platform. And I said that I wasn't even aware about the whole dissemination of art into the stream of commerce. I didn't know there was a stream of commerce for art. I thought it just art got made and art got put into a museum, naively. And that informs the fact that I never went to art school, the fact that I never studied art history, the fact that I never worked at a gallery, besides not knowing they existed, the fact that I never worked at a museum, the fact that I never went to a fucking museum until I was in college, My family never took me to a museum, not once in my entire life did I even know museums existed until I was procrastinating from my studies in Washington. And that's unlearning, because I never knew what you weren't supposed to do. And that has colored every single day of my life. And for me, I studied philosophy and political science, and I was very interested in the Middle Eastern crisis, which has persisted forever and will continue to do so. And my theory, which has gotten me screamed at by both Jews and Muslims alike, the reason Arabs and Jews hate each other so much is because they're the same. They're so genetically similar that it's like two brothers, like studying Hegel in philosophy, where when a person approaches the other, your first inclination is to eat, to devour them, to put an object into your mouth, to subsume it into yourself, or to be at loggerheads and be in conflict. And conflict, which you could see now, as much as the first day there was a fight between two people, that's human nature, unfortunately. This kind of, religion against religion, faith against faith, man
belief
against
systems.
yeah. There's strife and conflict is part of human nature, unfortunately. The way two brothers or brother and sister argue and fight amongst each other. So anyway, I studied Islam when I was in college because I didn't give a fuck about religion and still don't, but I wanted to understand. Like, I'm a child, I love curiosity, and every day I have not lost 1 degree of passion and curiosity about art from the first day that I went into the museum and saw a Twombly or a Warhol or a Basquiat before I even liked, grew to I mean, the things I have the greatest appreciation for, I never really liked in the beginning, just the way Zaha hated whenever people would present in like a work group for a project, whenever she would first see something, her first inclination was to dislike it. And it's a defense mechanism, but it makes you question everything. So in a way, like, I studied Islam, not because I wanted to understand in a very meaningful way what was driving this divisiveness. And it was 1 Jew and 99% Muslims in the class, because they all were engineering students. And I went to George Washington, the only college I got into, which was, it had students from 156 nations because of its location in Washington, D.C. And they had a large Arabic population and just a multicultural community due to the Washington and the diplomats and etc. And I was from Long Island, in the most isolated, alienated society, where I went from one high school, which was very diverse, and I used to get picked on and beaten up every day. And then I moved to a neighborhood which was completely homogenous. And anyway, in this Islam class, the teacher, unfortunately for all the Arab kids in the class, was an ancient Arabic scholar, and there was no easy grades for anyone. He was very rigorous. And we had to read the Quran from start to finish. And I'll never forget, like it was yesterday, and I forget because of many decades of drug and alcohol abuse and old age. There's not much I remember except for art and everything to do with all of my experience in art. Not all the people. I would never remember the billionaires or the important people. It meant nothing to me. But when it comes to art, objects, and artists, I never forgot a single thing. And I'll never forget how this teacher talked about these peasants in the mountains of Afghanistan. I mean, they were agrarian culture living in the hills, and they never took a class in their entire life, yet they managed to memorize verbatim every word of the Quran, all 350 pages of it. And that stuck in my head. And this notion of unlearning, like you go through school or art school and you're learning calculus and geometry and all trigonometry, or in art, you're learning all of this stuff that just leaves you ill-prepared for a day in the life of an artist. And when I go to art school, and I remember like going to a class and when I was doing studio critique at Rhode Island School of Design, and two things stuck with me. One was an artist who was a sculptor, and he's like, I can't get access to the photography department because I'm a sculptor. And they built these Chinese walls around all the departments. And I was just like, so taken aback, like, how could I mean, one of the biggest changes in the making of art today versus 50 years ago, that artists were painters, sculptors, video makers, conceptual, abstract, blah. And today, like an artist like Rachel Harrison is blurring every distinction between all of the modalities of making art, where she was stuck into a new photographer's show at the Museum of Modern Art because they just didn't know how to categorize what she was doing. And these conservative way of approaching realms of knowledge and erecting all of these ridiculous barriers and structures have no bearing on real life. So in any way, unlearning to me meant, and then another artist, so, you know, another artist said, oh, this artist, I shouldn't say her name, but it was like Janine Antoni, who's a very kind of politically minded artist, who's a great artist. But she's like, but Janine Antoni told me I shouldn't use red in this instance. And I just thought, like, what does that mean? Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. Like, when I do a studio critique, my role is not to like tell an artist how to make art or what colors to use. It's just to say, like, maybe you should be aware that this artist 40 years ago made something very similar, which you may not be aware of, or this artist now is making something concurrently with what you're doing that you may not be aware of, or you know, it's to bring information to the fore, which the artist may not be aware of, to enrich them and enlighten them about something they just may not be cognizant of. So anyway, it's all of these things that for me, thank God I never worked at a gallery. Thank God I never knew what you weren't supposed to do, because I fuck up every single day, make mistakes, embarrass myself, humiliate myself, even worse, humiliate my family, and post things I shouldn't post and say things I shouldn't say and do things I shouldn't do. But because I'm human and because I'm not scared, and so many people, unfortunately, are so career-oriented and so calculating and strategic about what they do and how they do it, it's just boring. And in the end, even if I'm not making a shit load of money, and I never will, I don't want to die with $1 billion. It has no meaning to me whatsoever. I'm sure my kids would rather I do so, but all I could give to them is an art collection that enriched my life and helped me to like understand and appreciate art more by, as I'm speaking to you, staring at a Mary Heilman painting, a Paul Thek drawing, and various other fill-in-the-blank art, a Cecily Brown painting she gave to me, sculptures and drawings and photographs that don't have, relatively speaking, high values, but mean the world to me. And they inform me on a regular basis. And I was saying before about the quarantine, it gave me time to take stock and really focus on what's important to me. And if there was never another art fair for the rest of my life, I would be grateful for that fact.
What is amazing about you is that you have this duality of this kind of profound understanding and sensibility towards the art and the object and the kind of philosophy behind it. But then also you really can look at it, you're capable of looking at it from a kind of economical prism. So what about art that you can't buy?
You could buy everything. And like Vito Acconci masturbated under the floor, and he was involved in this movement called like dematerialization in art. But the fact is that the market can swallow whole anything and everything, and will. So like I remember getting into an argument with Tino Segal, who basically would make art, but all you would get upon purchase, and they're not cheap, they started like $100,000 when he made a piece of like 2 people kissing on the floor, or these relational aesthetics that are artworks that exist in and of themselves only as encounters or relationships between people. So in the end, you could buy his work, and often for a lot of money. And I got into an argument because he was moaning about the fact that it's so hard for him to sell work. And like everything, like even Vito spoke about the fact that he was making art specifically that couldn't be consumed or subsumed within an economy or collected, and yet it always inevitably, the market found a way to do so. And I remember I bought a piece, there was a piece of art that I saw that I loved by the artist Darren Bader. And I just remember seeing a photograph in an art fair, and it was a piece called Grayness and Anus. And he just made this piece, and the piece was the words grayness and anus make some kind of manifestation for purposes of exhibition of these words in relationship to each other. And there was a show at Blum and Poe Gallery, and they exhibited this photograph, and it was a gray chart, a color chart with different grays stuck between the cheeks of someone's ass. And that was the piece. And that was exhibited at Blum and Poe, and later it was exhibited in an art fair. And you could buy that piece, but the photograph wasn't part of the piece. In that case, unlike Tino Segal, where you can't even get a certificate, you just, a notary comes and notifies the like makes a witness to a transaction, and that's with a bunch of rules and regulations about how you could subsequently restage that interaction. And with this anus and grayness, you did get a certificate, but no aesthetical representation of the grayness and anus that I saw. And anyway, and I remember like years and years later, I went to a dinner for the artist at Sadie Cole's gallery, and I got wasted completely. And I stumbled over to the table where Darren was, and he was sitting with his mother, and I, kind of bravado, drunken way, said, "I love your grayness and anus. Is it still available?" And he's like, "Yeah." So I'm like, "How much is it?" And I'm stumbling and mumbling and slurring, and in front of his mother, no less, and one of his dealers. And he's like, "It's 15 grand. And then I just went home and fell out of the taxi. And I had said to him, "I'll take it." And of course, there was like a very sober art dealer sitting beside him who informed the New York dealer, Andrew Krebs, of I made this foolish, blacked out agreement to buy this piece. And Andrew Krebs called me the next day and he goes, "Yeah, you were drunk. That was obvious to everyone. And you agreed to buy this piece, and I'll sell it to you. I'll give it to you for $12,000. But you get this certificate." And I said, he goes, "But I will let you cancel it because I understand your situation at the time." And I said, "You know what, I'll go through with it, but I want a photograph. I'm not buying air. I want something to hang on the wall. I want a depiction of grayness and anus, like the one I saw in the art fair." And he said, okay, let me speak to Darren, who I've since become friendly with. And he spoke to the artist, and the artist said no go on the photo. And then I said to Andrew, "Look, I've reneged on art deals I've made in the past. I'm not going to lie to you. When I got too overzealous and then realized from hindsight I had no money to buy something, nor would I anytime soon, and canceled. But I really loved that idea. I just thought it was really funny. And I love humor and conceptual art wedded together. It's not something that happens successfully, regularly, conceptual and humor wedded together." Anyway, and then I said to Andrew, "I'll take it, but I want the photo." Darren Bader said no. I said to Andrew, "You make me a bootleg photo of the piece and I'll buy it." And he did, and I did. And now I'm the proud owner of Grayness and Anus with a fake photograph not sanctioned by the artist. But anyway, like back to what you were saying before, I think that art and economics, even though it seems anomalous that it's self-negating and oxymoronic, there should be mandatory classes in art and economics in school. And people just don't understand, even though art has become much more monetized in the past 25 years to the extent it's never been before, but art and money have been in bed for hundreds of years. Rembrandt had the biggest house in Amsterdam and collected all the art of his peers and went bankrupt. I was just saying recently that Albert Dürer,
you did an artwork on that.
Many. And Albert Dürer was into money and had a shop for prints. And he said on record, like, why would I make a painting when I can make so much more money making a multiple print? And he sued for copyright, and Da Vinci was sued for not following through with his commissions if a better one came on board. So I've said art and money. I've made an art piece where art and money are in separate bed, and a Rothko is smoking a cigarette, because art and money are in bed together and they fuck, but they don't sleep in the same bed afterwards, because I love art and I like what money can do, which is basically buy more art and let me travel to see it and help my family. But you could never, I mean, I guess it's a shame that I'm a rarity in as much as the depth of how much I love art and the fact that I'm very aware of the machinations that go into the buying and selling of it. Because, yeah, I mean, I say that I never get to talk about art because I'm in the art world and nobody wants to hear about it. All they want to know is who's buying it, who's selling it, and who's showing it. And that's a shame, because, I mean, the reason I teach and the reason I always open up my home to different groups from museums, because I get to actually talk about what we're looking at, which is the art piece itself and why it's important to me. And if you ever lose sight of that, you're in the wrong profession. And unfortunately, there's a profession of people involved in art that don't know the first thing about it other than how they could make money from it. And that's tragic.
Will your home ever become a museum, do you think?
I don't give a shit about that. And I hate private museums unless they're in a jurisdiction where there's no public museums. And I think it's a joke. And I don't care if my kids sell every piece of art I've ever bought before my body gets cold. I'm not building an edifice to myself or my vision, if I have any. My taste is like largely half the things I sell, I lose money on to this day. And I just don't care, because I derive a great degree of pleasure from the mere looking. So my house is rammed with art. I'm desperately trying to control myself and not buy art for a year so I can put money together to buy a place so I don't have to move anymore or continue to sell the things I love and care about. But I'm not buying art for any other purposes other than edification and like it's surrounding myself with books and great documentaries. And I mean, the more I actualize my dreams and myself by having an audience, I mean, I make non-material art that's free on YouTube and Vimeo. And like, I'm more active making art today than I've ever been in my life. And I have no market for my art and I don't give a shit about it. It's the last thing that goes into the making of it. I mean, I'm making more objects now because I've made a couple of sculptures over the past couple of years, and I've made photographic representations from video stills and computer manipulated outputs of photographic pieces I've made. And I invented a way to write articles, which is to include my videos and my artworks. So I have a one-person show every month on ArtNet. But I'm always shocked when people buy my videos, because I've sold them over the past couple of years when I've had the opportunity to exhibit my work. I mean, it's very surprising, and I feel, I'm not gonna lie, I feel guilty doing so, because I believe in this very anarchic, free democratic notion, non-hierarchical dissemination of art and my art. And like, I collect posters, prints, paintings, sculptures, chairs, cars, objects, everything. But when I came back from this recent trip to London, I had the weirdest epiphany, which I have never had. And for the first time in my life, I felt stifled or suffocated by how much stuff that I have. And I went to my storage in London.
You still have storage in London?
I have storage in Switzerland, London.
At a Freeport?
New Jersey, whatever, in the warehouse. It doesn't matter if it's a Freeport or not, I'm still gonna lose money on it when I sell it, probably, in more instances than not. Although I've made money and I've made good amounts of money and I've lost great amounts of money. It doesn't matter. I was on the phone to my shrink the other day and I explained to her when I was trying to fill out a recommendation for my kid to get an apartment for their lease. I don't know how much money I've made since the first year out of law school or the second year. One year I made 150,000, and then I thought I was going to be the richest, most successful artist dealer in the world. Then the next year there was a recession and I made $15,000, and I never, ever took note. I cannot tell you within 50,000 or 100,000 how much money I've made for any of the last 28 years. I don't care. As long as I can pay my bills and not be buried in debt, that's all, that's enough. It means nothing to me. I just want to know, like, anyway, so now I had this revelation where I'm getting to the point where I could, you know, write for a little more money, teach for a little more money, not sell my art regularly because I still can't, but I have, and that contributes towards my life. So, I mean, in the best of all worlds, I would be making a living from selling my own art and writing and teaching, and then I wouldn't have to sell my collection, and I would be able to give more to my kids to do what they want with it. But I still wouldn't change anything about what I do and how I do it.
What was the revelation you had in London?
I'm getting buried alive by my stuff. And it was like this addiction, like alcoholism and drug addiction, and eating disorders, which I've had since I was 5. It's a way of like getting a dopamine hit and satisfying an emotional want or need, a perceived need that doesn't really exist. And it was almost like the chemical brain reaction that I would derive by buying something, eating something, drinking something, or smoking something. I'm starting to get from just speaking to people like you and communicating and teaching and being recognized by my peers, not for being remunerated for it, although that would be nice, just the fact that I have an audience and people that care to hear what I think about art is, for the first time, it's fulfilling in ways that I never dreamt could be imaginable.
Kenny, I think you should do a Netflix documentary similar to the Fran Lebowitz one.
Well, you're so funny, but I'm actually doing one because I got robbed for $2 million by my best friend, and rather than, I did something which I'm pretty proud of, because I'll tell you quickly, in 1996, there was a great curator, he still is, called Dan Cameron, and a reporter from the New York Times called him and asked him for some referrals of people that were carving out ways of making a living in an art world that was in the depth of a recession, which is not dissimilar to where we are now. People that were like this do-it-yourself mentality, which we're talking about now, largely, well, I mean, it was around in the days of Impressionist art. Those artists, before their work was canonized, Manet had to borrow money from his mother to build a temporary structure to show his art. Hogarth sold his own art at auction, 200 years before Damien Hirst. And nothing is new. But anyway, this reporter wanted to do something about contemporary art in the 90s and how artists were taking responsibility for creating opportunities where none existed. And anyway, it's funny because her name literally just popped up on my screen. This writer, it's so weird in that regard. This writer called me looking for recommendations, and being the publicity whore that I am still, and the fact that I'm so anxious always to be heard, because like I said, an audience fulfills the social contract of art and life. And because I work by myself, I practically live by myself. And so going around socializing for business and for art is the only social intercourse I have to this day. And anyway, this woman who just buzzed, because I'm still in touch with her 25 years later, Ellen Paul, she called me just to get the names of a few people that are involved in showing their own art and stuff. And I said, oh, why don't you come over and I'll talk to you about it. And then I railroaded her into writing about me. And it became a cover story for the New York Times Magazine section in 1996. And I basically just commandeered the whole article. So even though it was about a small handful of people, it was largely about me and my do-it-yourself shows that I did in the 90s. And this documentary maker just called me up because he wanted to do a documentary about an article I wrote for New York Magazine about Indigo Philbrick stealing $100 million or anywhere between 50 to 100 million. And he was basically not just one greedy person, he was brilliant. And it's a tragedy because he was so talented, but he was enabled by the greed surrounding the art world that put him in a position to so freely extract money from all of these seemingly clever business people. He was just a product of the times and where the art world is at this point in time. Anyway, there was this one out of all the different movie studios, and there was tons of them that called me, because everyone loves to hear a car crash. Everyone loves to turn around. There's an expression called looky-loo.
Sensationalism.
Yeah, so no, but it's like human nature to see someone who was on the up and up take a precipitous fall. That's just, we feel better about ourselves to see someone self-destruct, and that has existed for time immemorial. Anyway, one of the many producers and movie studios that called me was someone who had gone to fine art school. So I basically corralled him into changing his notion of a documentary, rather than be about Indigo, to be about the art world through my experiences and my eyes. So when I had the last Hoarder sale, which I've now branded into a yearly occurrence so I can sustain myself, the last version, we did this very conceptual, like almost, I love to sabotage myself and the structures of the art world in my practice. So we kept open to the public. I kept office hours at Sotheby's, where any freak or whatever could come in, from Jerry Saltz to like literal psychotics off the street, to see my exhibition that was a precursor to my sale. And anyway, I